The cracked high school parking lot sat under a low, gray autumn sky, rain threatening but never falling, like the town itself holding its breath. Sirens wailed somewhere beyond the buildings, close enough to hear but far enough to feel useless. On the cold asphalt lay Caleb Quiet, Mercer, a 14-year-old autistic boy curled in on himself, blood smeared across his knuckles, his backpack ripped open. Loose notebook pages were scattered around him, fluttering in the wind like broken feathers, every page filled with words no one ever listened to. 5 varsity bullies stood a few steps away, breathing hard, faces pale. They were not shocked by what they had done. They were shocked by what they had just heard. Caleb had spent years learning how to disappear. Today he chose not to. He chose to stand between fists and a smaller boy who had no chance on his own. Now Caleb barely moved, his body trembling, while the younger kid he protected shook uncontrollably nearby, phone pressed to his ear as he whispered to his father that something terrible had happened. Somewhere in the distance, engines growled, low, heavy, and getting closer. What happens when the system fails, and a different kind of family answers the call? Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. If stories like this matter to you, hit subscribe. Ronan Graveyard. Walsh had a presence that bent the air around him. He did not need to raise his voice or flex his authority. Rooms adjusted themselves the moment he stepped inside. Tall and broad-shouldered, his body was a map of ink and scars, each tattoo earned, not chosen. Years earlier, he had been a Marine combat engineer, the kind trained to move forward when everyone else froze. War had carved discipline into him, taught him restraint, and left him with a personal code that did not fade when he traded desert camis for leather and steel. As a Hells Angels road captain, Ronan was known not for recklessness, but for control. He was the man sent when things needed to be handled cleanly, decisively, and without chaos. When he looked at someone, they felt weighed, measured, and seen, whether they wanted to be or not. Caleb Quiet, Mercer existed at the opposite end of the world Ronan moved through. 14 years old, underweight, and perpetually overlooked, Caleb learned early that noise made him a target. He had not always been silent. Once he spoke freely to his father, a Marine who understood structure, routine, and how to ground a child in a loud world. That ended with a knock on the door and a folded flag. Caleb survived that loss. He survived his mother's long fight with cancer too, watching hospital rooms replace kitchens and whispered reassurances replace bedtime stories. When she died, something inside him shut down. Words became too heavy to carry. From that moment on, Caleb spoke through a battered notebook, its pages filled with careful handwriting that adults smiled at, accepted, and quietly ignored. As an autistic foster kid, Caleb learned the architecture of cruelty. He noticed patterns others dismissed. He saw who was protected and who was disposable. He moved gently through hallways, oversized Marine shirts hanging off his thin frame, fingers tapping in steady rhythms to keep himself anchored. He was observant, empathetic, and quietly unbreakable in ways no one bothered to test until it was too late. Evan Walsh was the reason everything collided. Younger than Caleb, smaller, and unprepared for the violence that found him, Evan carried his father's honesty without his armor. When fear took hold, he did not freeze or lie. He called for help. Shaking and breathless, he told the truth because he trusted that someone would come. Evan was the bridge between two worlds that were never meant to meet. A silent foster kid and an outlaw road captain bound by a code older than either of them. The force that preyed on both boys wore varsity jackets and easy smiles. Logan Price was their ringleader, a star football player groomed on praise and immunity. He moved through the school like he owned it, because in every practical sense he did. Violence came easily to him, justified by laughter and cameras pointed at someone else's pain. His pack, Mason Trent, Kyle Rourke, Dylan Frost, and Aaron Lynn, were extensions of his will. They provided numbers, intimidation, and constant recording, turning humiliation into entertainment. Together, they reinforced a simple truth. The school refused to challenge. Power belonged to those with status. Behind them stood men in offices who perfected silence as a weapon. Principal Howard Klein was an expert at burying problems beneath procedure and language. Incidents became misunderstandings. Bruises became self-inflicted. Reports vanished into filing cabinets that never seemed to open again. Above him loomed Victor Price, Logan's father, and a school board power broker whose donations spoke louder than any complaint. To him, consequences were obstacles that money could move. Children like Caleb were unfortunate variables, easily written off. Against that machinery stood the brotherhood Ronan belonged to. Big Hank Stonewall Miller, the chapter president, carried authority like bedrock, slow, steady, and immovable. Eli Lawdog Crane brought an ex-cop's patience and a hunter's instinct, able to turn rumors into timelines and lies into evidence. Noah Doc Reyes, a combat medic by trade, understood broken bodies and quieter wounds, the kind that came from being left alone too long. Simon Scholar Park had once been a special education advocate, fluent in both compassion and systems, knowing exactly how paperwork could be twisted into neglect. None of them preached brotherhood. They lived it, showing up, staying put, and doing the work no one else would. The town itself mirrored its people. On the surface, it looked clean and orderly, trim lawns, fresh paint, Friday night lights. Underneath, rot spread where no one wanted to look. The high school was all fluorescent glare and polished floors, sterile and hostile to anyone who did not fit the mold. The clubhouse, by contrast, felt heavy and grounded, walls soaked with history, oil, and loyalty. It was not pretty, but it was honest. In that contrast lived the heart of the story, a place that punished difference and a family that protected it not with speeches, but with presence. It started like every other day had started for Caleb Quiet. Mercer measured steps, head down, eyes scanning for trouble the way some people scanned for friends. The halls of Roosevelt High were loud in a way that felt weaponized. Locker doors slammed like gunshots. Laughter echoed too sharp. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, turning every surface into a glare Caleb could feel behind his eyes. He moved through it all like a shadow, fingers tapping a steady rhythm against his thigh to keep his body from floating away in the noise. He had learned the routes that kept him alive, the long way around the cafeteria, the far staircase where the athletes rarely went, the side exit near the old auditorium that spat him out toward the parking lot without making him walk past the trophy case. He carried his battered notebook under one arm like a shield because it was the only voice most adults would accept from him, if they accepted it at all. For years he had tried. He had written down names, dates, places. He had described what happened in hallways, in bathrooms, behind the gym, on the bus. He had torn pages out and handed them to teachers with hands that shook, because giving someone your truth and watching them smile politely was its own kind of humiliation. Sometimes they promised they would look into it. Sometimes they sighed and told him to avoid conflict. Sometimes they warned him not to misinterpret things. The pages always disappeared. The bruises always came back. On that afternoon, the air outside carried that late fall bite, the kind that smelled like wet leaves and cold metal. Dismissal had just spilled out into the parking lot clusters of kids, laughing, shouting, heading for cars. Caleb stuck to the edge like he always did, walking the perimeter where the shadows lived. He could almost taste freedom when he reached the far side of the building, where the dumpsters sat behind a tall chain-link fence and a row of dead shrubs. It was quiet back there. Quiet meant safe. Then he heard it. A small voice, high, cracking, begging. It wasn't just words. It was the sound under them, the panicked pull of breath. The way fear makes someone speak faster and stumble over syllables. Caleb froze, heart hammering hard enough to shake his ribs. His instinct screamed at him to keep walking. Disappear. Live. That was what he had been trained to do by every day Roosevelt High had swallowed him whole and spit him out again. But the pleading continued, sharp as a blade. Caleb eased toward the corner of the building, staying close to the brick. He peeked around and saw a smaller boy, Evan Walsh, pinned between the dumpsters and a wall of concrete. Evan's backpack was on the ground, spilled open. Books lay in the dirt. His hands were raised, palms open, like he could talk his way out of it. He couldn't. Logan Price stood in front of him, varsity jacket unzipped, smiling the way predators smiled when they knew no one would stop them. Mason Trent and Kyle Rourke flanked him, blocking the path out. Dylan Frost leaned against the dumpster, phone held up and recording, already laughing. Aaron Lynn bounced on his heels, eager, like this was warm-up before practice. Evan tried to step sideways, but Kyle shoved him back so hard his shoulder smacked metal. The sound echoed. Evan winced. Logan leaned in close, speaking softly, like he wanted the moment to feel intimate. Caleb's stomach tightened. He recognized the choreography. He had been Evan more times than he could count. The cornering, the humiliation, the filming, the laughter, the certainty that no adult would appear. Logan's eyes flicked toward Caleb's hiding spot. For a heartbeat, Caleb thought he hadn't been seen. Then Logan smiled wider. "Well, look what the wind dragged in," Logan said, loud enough for the whole alley to hear. "Quiet boys here." Caleb's fingers tapped faster, a frantic drumbeat. He wanted to run. He wanted to disappear into the parking lot and keep walking until the town ran out behind him. But Evan's eyes found him, wide, pleading. Not because Evan expected Caleb to save him, because Evan was a kid who still believed seeing someone meant help might exist. Caleb pulled his notebook open with shaking hands. His pen scraped the paper so hard, the ink bled through. He wrote 3 words in block letters and held them up like a sign. "Leave him alone." For a second, even the bullies paused, not out of respect, out of surprise. Caleb never stepped into anything. Caleb never volunteered to be visible. Caleb survived by being forgettable. Logan laughed first. "He brought his little diary," he said. "That's cute." Mason snatched at the notebook. Caleb jerked it back, clutching it to his chest. Logan stepped closer, towering over him. Caleb could smell cologne and cheap energy drink on his breath. "You gonna write us another complaint?" Logan asked. "You gonna tell a teacher?" "Oh, wait." He glanced around theatrically. "They don't care about you, do they?" The words landed exactly where Logan meant them to. Caleb's throat tightened. His brain flashed images of adults smiling and filing him away, of the principal's office door shutting, of his foster mom's tired face when she asked, again, if the school was doing anything, of the answer always being no. Evan's voice rose again, trembling. Please stop." Logan turned on Evan like he'd forgotten him. He shoved Evan into the dumpster hard enough to make the metal ring. Evan cried out. Caleb moved without thinking. 1 step, then another. He placed himself between Logan and Evan, shoulders squared, notebook held up again. The moment Caleb did it, the world shifted. Logan's smile vanished. "Bad choice," he said almost calmly, and then he nodded. Kyle hit Caleb first, a hard shove that sent him stumbling. Caleb caught himself, but Mason was already there, yanking the backpack strap and spinning him around. The notebook fell. Pages scattered across the dirt. Dylan's phone tracked it all, zooming in, hungry. Caleb didn't swing back. He didn't curse. He didn't beg. He did the only thing his father had ever taught him that mattered when you couldn't win a fight. He positioned himself like a wall. He moved back in front of Evan again, using his own body to block the smaller boy. Logan's fist slammed into Caleb's ribs. Pain flared white-hot. Caleb folded, but he did not fall away from Evan. Another hit landed. Then, a kick to his thigh. Aaron laughed as his shoe connected with Caleb's hip. Bones didn't break loudly. They broke with dull sounds, like thick branches snapping underfoot. Caleb tasted copper. The world narrowed. He heard Evan shouting his name. Caleb didn't know. Evan knew it. And then Evan's voice changed. "Dad!" Evan cried into his phone. "Dad, please, they're killing him." Ronan Graveyard. Walsh was on the road when the call came. The engine under him was steady, the wind cold against his face, the rhythm of riding doing what it always did, quieting the noise in his head. He answered on instinct, because you answered when your kid called, no matter what. "Evan," Ronan said, already hearing it. The tremor in his son's voice, the broken breathing, the sound of panic that didn't belong in a child's throat. "Dad?" Evan choked. "There's a kid." He stepped in. "There's 5 of them, behind the dumpsters, please." Ronan didn't ask unnecessary questions. War had trained that out of him. He needed location. He needed confirmation. He needed a plan. His voice dropped into the calm, controlled tone that made Marines listen even when bullets were flying. "Stay on the line," he ordered. "Tell me where you are." "Can you see the parking lot? Can you get to a safe spot?" "They won't let me move," Evan whispered, and the sound of a punch followed by a grunt cut through the call. Ronan's hands tightened on the bars. The world around him vanished. There was only his son's fear and the echo of men screaming for medics overseas. He turned his bike hard, tires biting the pavement, and gunned it toward Roosevelt High like the road was a battlefield and time was bleeding out. Back behind the dumpsters, Caleb's body began to fail him. Pain blurred into numbness. He was on his knees, one hand pressed to the ground, trying to stay upright. Logan grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and yanked him up just to slam him back down. Caleb's head struck concrete. His vision exploded with stars. Through it all, he kept angling himself toward Evan, trying to stay between Evan and the fists. It was the last clear thought he had. If I can take it, he doesn't have to. Teachers passed the far end of the lot and looked away. A janitor paused, saw the group, and kept walking. Someone knew. Someone always knew. The system was not blind. It was obedient. Then a new sound entered the world. An engine, not distant now, but close, furious, cutting through the parking lot like a warning. A motorcycle slid into view at the edge of the alley, brakes screaming. Ronan swung off before it fully stopped, boots hitting ground like punctuation. The bullies didn't recognize him as a parent at first. They recognized him as a problem. Leather cut. Tattoos. A Marine bearing. A gaze that didn't flinch. Logan backed up half a step, uncertain for the first time in his life. Ronan didn't speak to them, not yet. He moved straight to Caleb, dropping to one knee with the kind of practiced urgency that came from battlefield triage. He checked Caleb's breathing, his pulse, the angle of his limbs. His hands were steady, but his jaw was clenched hard enough to ache. Caleb's eyes fluttered. Through the haze, he saw the ink on Ronan's forearm, Marine symbols, the kind his father once wore with pride. Recognition sliced through the fog like sunlight through storm clouds. Caleb's lips parted. For nearly a year, words had stayed trapped inside him like a locked door. But this looked like his father's world. This felt like safety, the kind he thought died with the flag folded into a triangle. Caleb swallowed, throat raw, and pushed sound out. "Is he okay?" he rasped, voice cracked, fragile, and real. Ronan froze for a fraction of a second, not expecting it. Then he looked over Caleb's shoulder and saw Evan, shaking, tears cutting clean lines down his face. "He's alive," Ronan said, voice low. "You kept him alive." Caleb blinked slowly. "They do it every week," he whispered, each word costing him. "No one comes." Something in Ronan's expression changed. It wasn't rage yet. It was something colder. Something settled. The kind of decision a man made when he stopped hoping someone else would fix it. He looked back at Caleb, at the bruises that weren't just from today, at the hollow look of a kid who had learned he didn't matter. Then Ronan reached to his own vest and pulled free a small piece of leather. His road captain patch, worn, creased, and heavy with meaning. He pressed it into Caleb's trembling hand like a vow. "You hear me quiet?" Ronan said. "You ain't alone anymore." Caleb's fingers curled around the patch like it was the first solid thing he'd held in years. Ronan stood, finally turning toward Logan and the others. His voice stayed calm, but the air around it sharpened. "This ends," he said. "Right now." And in that moment, walking away stopped being an option, because Caleb had protected Ronan's son. And in Ronan's world, that invoked the code. The kind of code written in blood, loyalty, and brotherhood. From that second forward, Caleb quiet, Mercer wasn't just a victim the system could bury, he was family. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and old fear, the kind that lived in waiting rooms and never quite left. Caleb quiet. Mercer lay beneath harsh lights with bruises blooming across his skin like dark storms. His ribs rose shallowly, each breath careful, as if his body had learned the cost of existing. Machines hummed beside him, steady and indifferent, while nurses moved in practiced loops that treated injuries without touching the story behind them. Ronan graveyard. Walsh stood at the foot of the bed like a sentry, arms crossed, eyes locked on the boy's face. He had seen broken men in places that didn't have hospitals. He had watched friends bleed out in sand and smoke, But watching a kid, thin, silent, discarded, hurt in a way that didn't fit any battlefield memory. This wasn't war. This was supposed to be home. A doctor came in with a clipboard and a guarded expression, the look of someone who had seen too much harm and learned to stay professional just to survive it. Ronan listened as the man spoke about fractured ribs, a concussion, internal bruising. Then the doctor hesitated, eyes dropping to the chart again. "These injuries," he said carefully, "some aren't fresh." Ronan didn't move. "Explain." The doctor pointed out faint marks, half-healed bruises in places that didn't match today's beating, old fractures that hadn't been treated properly. The kind of damage that didn't happen once, the kind that happened over and over until the body stopped reacting like it expected rescue. Ronan's jaw tightened. He glanced at Doc Reyes, the club's combat medic, who stood near the window like a shadow. Doc had been quiet since arriving, but his eyes were sharp, reading Caleb's body like it was a map to a crime scene. Doc stepped forward and spoke low. "He's been carrying this a long time," he said. "Long enough that pain feels normal." Caleb's fingers twitched on the blanket. His notebook lay on the bedside table, edges frayed, spine cracked. Doc picked it up gently, like it mattered. He flipped through pages filled with neat handwriting, names, dates, short descriptions. Words like locker room, bathroom, parking lot. Entries that read like reports no one ever filed. Doc looked at Ronan. "He tried," he said. "They just didn't listen. The first escalation didn't come from fists. It came from realization. This wasn't a single incident that could be swept away with apologies and suspensions. This was a pattern, engineered, protected, practiced. Ronan left the hospital long enough to breathe cold air and make calls. Not frantic calls, not emotional calls. Clean ones. Stonewall answered first. Big Hank Stonewall. Miller didn't waste time with greetings. "Talk," he said. Ronan told him what happened, what the doctor said, what Doc saw in the notebook. He told him about the school board name attached to the ringleader. He told him about the way teachers looked away. Stonewall was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gravel. "We don't move stupid," he said. "We move smart." "You got your boy safe? He's with Doc," Ronan said. "And I'm not leaving the other one alone either." "Good," Stonewall replied. "Then we start building the case. No heat we can't back up. No moves without receipts." That night, Doc stayed at Caleb's bedside. Not for show, not for intimidation. Just staying, the way no one ever stayed for Caleb before. Nurses came and went. Lights dimmed and brightened again. Caleb woke in small bursts, eyes unfocused, hand reaching automatically for his notebook like it was the only thing that belonged to him. Each time he woke, Doc was still there. Caleb wrote with shaky fingers. "Why?" Doc read it, then leaned in close enough that his voice felt safe. "Because you didn't let that little one fight alone," he said, "and we don't leave our own." Caleb stared at him, trying to understand a world where people came back after saying they would. Ronan came back before sunrise, tired lines carved into his face. Instead of firing questions, instead of demanding details like an interrogation, he sat down. He watched Caleb's fingers tap out their rhythm on the blanket. He noticed how Caleb flinched when footsteps passed too close in the hallway. He noticed how Caleb's eyes followed the door every time it opened, like he expected danger to walk in wearing a smile. Ronan spoke softly. "You don't gotta talk," he said. "You write what you can. You rest when you need. I'm here." Caleb swallowed, then wrote slowly. "They said it was my fault before." Ronan's eyes sharpened. "Who said that?" Caleb's pen hovered, then moved. "The principal." "The office. They said, I misunderstand. They said I hurt myself." Ronan felt something cold settle in his chest. He didn't respond with rage. Rage was easy. Rage was what people expected from a biker. Instead, he let it harden into purpose. The next escalation hit outside the hospital, in the clean, well-lit offices of Roosevelt High. By mid-morning, Ronan walked through the front entrance like he belonged there. Parents in the lobby stared. A receptionist stiffened. Ronan's leather cut and tattoos didn't match the school's polished image, and that alone was enough to make people nervous. Principal Howard Klein met him in the hallway with a smile so practiced it could have been stapled to his face. "Mr. Walsh," he said, tone smooth. "I understand there was an incident." Ronan didn't shake his hand. He held out a folder instead. Inside were printed photos of Caleb's injuries, copies of notebook pages, and the doctor's preliminary statement about prior trauma. "Not an incident," Ronan said calmly. "A pattern. Years long." Klein's smile faltered for half a breath before returning. "We take student safety seriously," he said, "but you have to understand, emotions are running high." "There are allegations on both sides." Ronan cut him off with a look. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't turn this into both sides. That kid didn't swing once. He shielded my son. I got a hospital report that says he's been hurt before. Plenty. You got records of complaints?" Klein blinked. "We have no official record of repeated incidents involving." "Then you're either lying," Ronan said, voice still level, "or your school's been shredding truth." Klein's expression tightened. Mr. Brescian tightened. "Walsh, you need to be careful with accusations. These are minors. There are confidentiality rules. There are procedures." Ronan nodded once. "Good," he said. "Then follow procedure. File the assault report. Hand over security footage. Preserve evidence. Call the police yourself, since you didn't before." Klein's eyes flicked toward the lobby where people were listening. He lowered his voice. "The student Caleb Mercer has challenges," he said. "Misinterpretations happen. Sometimes these situations are mutual. The boys involved have promising futures." The words hit Ronan like a slap, because he heard the meaning beneath them. Some kids matter more. Ronan leaned in just enough to make Klein uncomfortable. "That boy's future matters," he said, "and you're done making him disposable." By the time Ronan left the school, the counterattack had already begun. Rumors spread fast, shaped by people who had power to protect. Whispers moved through town that Caleb had started it, that he was unstable, that he attacked athletes and got hurt by accident. The narrative was being rewritten in real time, like it always was. A week ago, that lie would have worked. It had worked every time before. Now, it had Ronan's attention. Doc texted Ronan a photo from the hospital, a nurse's note documenting older bruises. Evidence. More pieces. Ronan forwarded it to Stonewall. Stonewall replied with 2 words. "Keep stacking." The club chose exposure over retaliation. No midnight beatdowns. No threats carved into doors. That was what the town expected and what the school could use to paint them as villains. Instead, they moved like a pressure system rolling in slow, undeniable, and backed by proof. Law dogs started pulling threads. Old complaints. Prior transfers. The names of kids who vanished from Roosevelt High without explanation. Scholar began contacting advocacy groups and digging into special needs protections the school might have violated. Doc kept a written log of every medical observation and nurse statement, time-stamped, signed, and copied. And Caleb, still bruised and fragile, did something he'd never done before. He wrote more. Not just about today. About all of it. The bathroom stall lunches. The locker slams. The times he'd been shoved and laughed at while teachers pretended not to see. His handwriting shook, but it didn't stop. The notebook stopped being a silent plea and became a witness. In small ways, silence began to crack. A nurse paused longer than necessary and whispered to Doc, "I'm glad someone's finally here for him." A hospital security guard nodded at Ronan with quiet respect, eyes saying he'd seen too much injustice too. Even Eben, still shaken, started telling his story to anyone who would listen, refusing to let Caleb's sacrifice be buried in paperwork. The momentum wasn't loud yet, but it was building like engines warming in the dark before a ride. Because once people realized someone was willing to stand beside the kid everyone ignored, the town had to face a question it couldn't dodge anymore. If the system wouldn't protect him, who would? And the answer was already forming, piece by piece, in leather, ink, and proof. The pressure didn't come like a punch. It came like a hand closing around a throat, slow, polite, and suffocating. By the second morning after Ronan Graveyard, Walsh walked into Roosevelt High with a folder of facts. The school's response shifted from denial to strategy. The first move was a letter-heavy paper, crisp letterhead, words written to sound reasonable while threatening ruin. It arrived at Ronan's door before noon, delivered by a courier who wouldn't meet his eyes. It wasn't signed by the principal. It was signed by the school board's legal counsel. The letter spoke about defamation. It spoke about harassment. It spoke about unlawful interference with school operations. It suggested that Ronan's associates were intimidating staff and students simply by being seen. It politely warned that if he continued, they would pursue legal action. Stonewall read it at the clubhouse, then folded it neatly and set it on the table like it was trash that didn't deserve to be crumpled. "They ain't trying to win in court," Big Hank Stonewall Miller said. "They trying to scare you into shutting up." Ronan's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. "Then we don't shut up," he replied. The second move was softer. A man in a suit approached Linda Mercer, Caleb's foster mother, in a grocery store parking lot. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped too close, smiled too wide, and asked if she understood how difficult fostering could become when issues followed a child. Linda drove home shaking. When Scholar Park arrived that evening to check on her, he found her sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee she hadn't drank. Caleb's room door was shut. The house was quiet in that tense, brittle way it got when fear lived in the walls. "They said I could lose him," Linda whispered. "They said, if I keep pushing, if I keep making noise, they'll say I'm not stable enough to foster." Scholar's face didn't soften with pity. It tightened with resolve. "That's not a warning," he said. "That's coercion." Linda nodded, tears gathering. "I'm trying," she said. "I swear I'm trying." Her voice broke. "I don't have power." Scholar leaned forward steady. "You do now," he said. "Because you're not alone anymore." Pressure was the town's favorite weapon. It worked because people feared losing their jobs, their reputations, their children. Roosevelt High wasn't just a building. It was a machine with donors and board members and booster clubs, people who treated football like religion and money like law. And Logan Price's father, Victor Price, was the priest of that machine. Law Dog Crane started digging deeper, and what he found made the air feel heavier. Donation records lined up with discipline decisions. Complaints spiked, then vanished after checks were written. Teachers who tried to push back mysteriously transferred or quit. A pattern of kids who didn't fit special needs, foster kids, poor kids, quietly exiting Roosevelt High like the building had spit them out. Law Dog didn't call it coincidence. He called it design. Still, the town pushed back hard the moment it sensed the machine might crack. The setback started with silence returning. A cafeteria worker who had initially admitted she saw Caleb being targeted suddenly couldn't remember clearly. A student who had filmed part of the beating deleted the video and insisted it never existed. Parents who had whispered support in private crossed the street when they saw Ronan outside the hospital. Fear spread like cold. Principal Klein leaned into it. He held meetings behind closed doors. He sent emails reminding staff about professional boundaries and legal consequences for misinformation. He used phrases like safety and responsibility, but what he meant was obedience. Ronan watched it all with the patience of a man who had seen fear break stronger people than this. In war, men froze when they believed they were alone. In towns like this, people froze for the same reason. Doc Reyes stayed at the hospital, his presence a steady anchor. Caleb was healing physically, slowly, but the deeper wounds, those didn't ease with stitches or time. He startled at footsteps. He flinched when voices rose. He kept writing, but even the notebook trembled in his hands now, as if the town's backlash had reached him through the walls. One afternoon, Ronan sat beside Caleb while Evan was in the hallway with a nurse. Caleb wrote a sentence, then scratched it out. Wrote again, scratched again. Finally, he pushed the notebook toward Ronan. "They're going to make it my fault." Ronan stared at the words, then looked at Caleb's face. Caleb wasn't being dramatic. He was being accurate. He had lived this cycle long enough to predict it. Ronan spoke low. "They're going to try," he said. "But they can't rewrite what's true if we hold the line." Caleb's pen moved slowly. They always do. That line hit Ronan somewhere old, a place he rarely touched. Because Ronan knew what it felt like to watch a system fail someone and realize you were too late. That night, after the clubhouse quieted and the younger guys filtered out, Stonewall found Ronan sitting alone in the garage area, staring at nothing. The smell of oil and smoke hung around him, familiar and grounding. Stonewall didn't ask gentle questions. He just stood there until Ronan spoke. "There was a kid over there," Ronan said finally, voice flat. "Not here. Overseas. Village outside the wire." Stonewall's brow tightened, but he stayed silent. Ronan kept going. "We were clearing a route. We found an IED set up. There was a boy, maybe about Evan's age. He was watching from behind a wall, scared. I told him to stay back. I thought he would. We moved forward." Ronan swallowed hard, jaw flexing. He didn't listen. He ran to his mother. And then, his voice stopped. Stonewall's eyes didn't blink. He already knew the ending. Ronan stared at the concrete floor. "I didn't get there in time," he said. "I still hear it sometimes. The blast. The screaming. The way his mother looked at us like we were gods who failed her." Stonewall finally spoke. "You did what you could," he said, but his tone wasn't comforting. It was firm. Ronan shook his head once. "No," he said. "I did what the mission demanded, and the kid paid anyway." Stonewall exhaled slowly. "That's why this matters to you," he said, not asking. Ronan's eyes lifted, dark and steady. "Caleb's that kid," he said. "Same look. Same helplessness. Same feeling like nobody's coming." His voice hardened. "But this time, I am." The next day, authority pressure tightened like a vice. Ronan expected the police to act fast once the hospital report and witness statements reached them. Instead, hesitation crawled out of the station in uniform. A detective returned calls slowly. Another suggested the case was complex. Someone mentioned that the families involved were prominent. Someone else hinted that pressing too hard would stir the town up. It wasn't justice, it was politics. Administration delays followed the same script. Security footage was suddenly unavailable due to maintenance. Incident reports were still under review. The principal insisted on internal investigation procedures before involving law enforcement, like he could wash assault clean with enough paperwork. And then came the ticking clock. Scholar Park discovered it first because he knew the language schools used when they wanted to bury something without looking guilty. He received a leaked email thread from a sympathetic staff member, someone too scared to sign their name but not too scared to send proof. The email outlined a plan. It wasn't to punish the bullies. It wasn't to protect Caleb. It was to remove the problem. They planned to quietly suspend Caleb for instigating conflict. They would label him a safety risk, claim he created disruption, and use the suspension to justify transferring him to an alternative program. They would paint it as concern. They would call it a fresh start. But it was exile. Scholar brought the printed email to Ronan and Stonewall at the clubhouse, laying it on the table like evidence in a murder case. The room went quiet as the brothers read it. Doc's jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. Law Dog's eyes went cold. Stonewall's hands stayed still, but the air around him changed. Ronan read every line twice. Then he set the paper down carefully, as if he was afraid tearing it might tear his control with it. Caleb had been beaten into a hospital bed, and the school's solution was to punish him. Ronan stood up slowly. "They're trying to erase him," he said. Stonewall nodded once. "And that means we're out of quiet options," he replied. Ronan didn't call for violence. He didn't slam fists or shout. He simply spoke with the calm of a man making an irreversible decision. "Then we drag it into daylight," he said. "All of it. Because now there was no time left for patience. No room left for waiting. The machine was moving, and if they didn't act, Caleb would become what he had always been to this town, an inconvenience, quietly removed." Ronan looked around the table at his brothers, and the code that held them together filled the silence like an engine rumble before a ride. "Right call," he said. "Dawn." And in that one word, the balance of power began to shift. Dawn came cold and colorless, the kind of morning that made breath look like smoke and turned every sound sharp. Roosevelt High sat quiet under the pale sky, lights still dim inside, the flag hanging limp with no wind to move it. For a few minutes, it looked like nothing had changed, like yesterday's violence had already been absorbed into the town's denial, filed away where inconvenient truths went to die. Then the first engine note rolled in. Low. Heavy, controlled. It came from beyond the neighborhood streets, beyond the sleeping houses and silent storefronts. It wasn't one bike. It was a rising chorus, layered and steady, like thunder that didn't rush but didn't stop either. The sound grew until it filled the air, and people began stepping onto porches in robes and slippers, eyes narrowing against the cold, trying to understand what they were hearing. They didn't have to wonder long. The first motorcycle appeared at the far end of the school's access road, headlight cutting through the gray. Then another. Then another. The line kept coming, not scattered, not chaotic tight spacing, disciplined formation. Riders in full colors, faces hard, posture upright. They moved like a unit with purpose, the kind you didn't see unless someone had made a decision. By the time the line reached the front of Roosevelt High, there were 83 bikes. The town woke up all at once. Parents pulling into the lot for early practice stopped and stared. A teacher arriving with coffee froze halfway out of her car. A janitor inside the building looked through the glass doors and went pale. Phones came out, curtains shifted in nearby houses. The school, which had always controlled what was seen and what wasn't, suddenly became the center of attention in a way it couldn't manage. The motorcycles rolled into the lot and formed a wide arc across the entrance, like a wall made of steel and leather. Engines stayed running for a moment, rumbling deep enough to feel in the chest, then cut out almost in unison, and the silence after was louder than the engines. Ronan Graveyard. Walsh swung off his bike first, boots hitting the pavement with a calm finality. His cut sat heavy on his shoulders, patches worn and real, ink visible down his forearms. Behind him, Big Hank Stonewall. Miller dismounted with the slow authority of a man who didn't hurry because he didn't have to. Log Dog Crane stepped down next, eyes scanning like he was already reading exits and angles. Doc Reyes carried a small bag, not because he expected violence, but because he expected the world to stay cruel. Scholar Park climbed off last, folder in hand, face set with quiet focus. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They didn't even spread out like men looking for a fight. They stood. A line of riders in full colors, still as statues, facing the glass doors of the school, like they were waiting for someone to remember what accountability looked like. Inside, Principal Howard Klein stared through the doors with a face that tried to hold authority but couldn't hide fear. He had spent his career controlling narratives behind closed doors. He understood instantly what this was. The narrative had been dragged outside. He turned, barking orders to staff, but his voice carried no power anymore. The building felt suddenly small. Within minutes, the superintendent's car screeched into the lot, followed by 2 police cruisers. Not because the school wanted justice, because the town wanted distance from scandal. Cameras began arriving too. Local news vans, reporters in coats, microphones already out. Someone had tipped them. Someone inside the town was tired of silence. Klein pushed through the doors, forcing a smile that looked like it hurt his face. "This is inappropriate," he called, voice loud but cracking at the edges. "You can't do this here. This is a school. There are children." Ronan didn't step forward aggressively. He stepped forward deliberately, holding a thick folder at his side like a weapon made of paper. "There were children when they beat Caleb," he said, voice even. "Did that matter to you then?" Klein's eyes flicked toward the cameras. "We're handling the situation through proper channels," he insisted. "The investigation," Stonewall cut in, his voice like rock grinding. "Your channel's been burying kids," he said, "so we brought our own." Scholar lifted the folder and spoke with the calm of someone who knew the law and the loopholes schools hid inside. "We have medical documentation indicating repeated past injury," he said. "We have written reports submitted over a long period. We have witness statements. We have evidence of intimidation. And we have correspondence showing you plan to suspend the victim instead of the attackers." The superintendent, Rebecca Torres, stiffened, eyes snapping toward Klein. Is that true? She demanded. Klein's smile faltered. That's a misunderstanding, he began. Lawdog stepped forward and opened his own folder, pulling out a neatly organized stack of copies. Not a misunderstanding, he said. An email thread, time-stamped. Names attached. And, while we're at it, donation records. He handed a copy to the superintendent. Victor Price writes checks, complaints vanish. This pattern's older than this week. The superintendent's face drained of color as she scanned the page. She looked up sharply. Where did you get this? Lawdog didn't blink. From people who finally got tired of being afraid. That was when the first witness broke. A woman in a cafeteria uniform stood near the edge of the gathering, hands trembling, eyes flicking between cameras and bikers and school officials. She took a shaky step forward, and her voice came out thin but clear. I saw it, she said. Not just yesterday. I saw them do things to that boy before. I saw him eating in the bathroom because nobody would let him sit. I told myself it wasn't my business. Her eyes filled. It was my business. The words hit the crowd like a match to dry grass. Murmurs rose. Parents started looking at each other, uneasy. Teachers shifted, guilt and fear twisting across faces. Then another voice spoke. A former teacher, Sandra Yates, walked into view with a flash drive hanging from a lanyard, like it weighed as much as a badge. She held it up for cameras to see. I kept copies, she said. Emails. Incident reports. Warnings. Threats from administration telling staff to stay quiet or lose jobs. I tried to fight it while I was there. They pushed me out. Her eyes locked on Klein. You don't get to bury it anymore. Klein's face tightened, eyes darting like an animal caught in headlights. This is an attack, he said. You're all intimidating. No, Ronan said quietly, and the word carried enough weight to stop Klein mid-sentence. This is exposure. And then the last crack came from inside the enemy's own bloodline. An older man stepped forward, shoulders hunched, face lined with shame and age. Frank Price. Logan's grandfather. He looked like someone who had spent too long living with a truth that rotted him from the inside. My son's been paying for this, Frank said, voice trembling but steadying as he spoke. Paying schools. Paying coaches. Paying people like Klein. Every time Logan hurt someone, there was money. Every time a kid cried, there was money. He swallowed hard, eyes wet. I'm done watching it happen. The cameras zoomed, the crowd gasped. Victor Price wasn't here yet, but his shadow filled the lot. The superintendent straightened, anger replacing shock. She turned to the officers. I want the footage preserved immediately, she snapped. I want all records secured, and I want those boys pulled from class, now. The officers hesitated just a fraction. That hesitation was the last remnant of the town's old power structure, the unspoken rule that wealthy families didn't get treated like everyone else. Ronan saw it, and he didn't step toward them like a threat. He simply turned his head toward the cameras and spoke loud enough for the microphones to catch. They're hesitating, he said calmly. Because the man who buys silence isn't here yet, but he will be. And the whole town's watching what you do when he shows up. The officer's jaw tightened. The cameras swung toward him. The pressure shifted. He nodded to his partner. Let's go, he said. Inside the building, footsteps thundered down hallways. Doors opened, voices rose. Within minutes, Logan Price and his pack were marched out, hands behind their backs, faces shifting from arrogance to panic as they saw the line of bikers, the cameras, the superintendent, and the crowd. Logan's eyes found Ronan. For the first time, he looked small. This is bullshit, Logan spat, trying to summon his old immunity. My dad. Your dad's gonna need a lawyer, Lawdog said, voice flat. Then Victor Price arrived, black SUV rolling into the lot like he still believed he owned the place. He stepped out with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his life. His face hardened the moment he saw his son in cuffs. What the hell is this? Victor barked. You can't do this to him. The superintendent walked right up to him, papers in hand. We can, she said coldly. And we are. You're being investigated for obstruction and bribery. Victor's mouth opened, then shut. His eyes flicked toward Klein, searching for the usual safety net. Klein wouldn't look at him, because the net was gone. Arrests happened in daylight, not whispered discipline. Not private meetings. Handcuffs clicked while cameras rolled. Power collapsed, not with an explosion, but with a series of small, undeniable moments. Witnesses speaking, evidence stacking, officials forced to act because the cost of ignoring it became too high. And through it all, the bikers didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They didn't posture. They stood there like a wall, ensuring no one could pretend it hadn't happened. Across town, in the hospital, Doc's phone buzzed with updates. He looked at Caleb lying in bed, pale and bruised, eyes half open. Caleb's notebook rested in his lap. Doc leaned in. "It's happening," he said softly. "They can't bury it now." Caleb's fingers tightened around his pen. He wrote a single line, slow and careful. "They saw me." Doc smiled, small and real. "Yeah," he said, "and they ain't unseeing you." Later that afternoon, Ronan returned to the hospital. He didn't come with loud stories. He came with quiet proof, a printed photo of the arrests, a news headline already forming, and a promise kept. He sat beside Caleb's bed and set his road captain patch on the table where Caleb could see it. "I told you," Ronan said, voice low. "You ain't alone." Caleb stared at him for a long moment, then swallowed hard. His throat worked like it was remembering how to do this. He didn't reach for the notebook. He spoke, barely above a whisper, voice cracked but present. "Thank you." Ronan nodded once, eyes shining with something he didn't let spill. "Welcome to the family," he said. And in that moment, the transformation was complete. Caleb, quiet. Mercer, who had been invisible for so long the world forgot he existed, was invisible no more. The fallout didn't explode all at once. It settled in layers, like dust after a building collapse, revealing damage the town could no longer pretend wasn't there. Within days, Principal Howard Klein was placed on administrative leave, escorted out of the building he once ruled with silence and smiles. His office door was sealed, records boxed, computers seized. Other administrators followed, faces tight and hollow as investigations widened and uncomfortable questions surfaced. Lawsuits were filed. Criminal charges began their slow, grinding march forward. What had once been handled in whispers was now written in public documents with letterheads and case numbers that couldn't be shredded. The school board issued statements full of regret and carefully chosen words, but the town heard what mattered beneath them. The machine had been exposed. The legal cases would take time, months, maybe longer, but the illusion of untouchable power was already gone. Parents demanded meetings. Teachers spoke more freely. Some cried when they admitted what they had seen and ignored. Others stayed quiet, ashamed. Either way, the town could no longer claim ignorance. Caleb quiet. Mercer left the hospital on a gray afternoon, his body still healing but no longer alone in the process. He didn't go back to the foster home that had tried its best and still been overwhelmed. Instead, he was welcomed into a therapeutic home run by people who understood trauma not as misbehavior, but as injury. The house was calm, structured, and warm in a way Caleb had never known. Lights were soft. Schedules were predictable. Silence was respected, not punished. Margaret Chen met him at the door with a gentle smile and no expectations. She had lost her own son to the same system years earlier, watched it chew him down and roll on without consequence. She didn't need explanations. She didn't rush him. She simply showed him his room, where the walls were bare and waiting to be filled with whatever made him feel safe. For the first time since his parents died, Caleb slept through the night. The changes came slowly, the way real healing always did. At first, Caleb still carried his notebook everywhere, fingers gripping it tight whenever voices rose or rooms felt too crowded. But he didn't have to write as much anymore. People waited for him. They watched his hands, his face, his breathing, and learned what his silence meant instead of demanding he fill it. Doc Reyes visited often, sometimes bringing snacks, sometimes just sitting with him on the porch in the late afternoon light. Ronan came too, not as an authority figure, not as a savior, but as a steady presence. Evan came with him, quieter now, carrying his own mix of guilt and gratitude. The boys didn't talk much at first. They didn't need to. They sat side by side, sharing space without pressure, learning that safety didn't always announce itself. Words returned to Caleb in pieces. A yes here, a thank you there. Short sentences spoken softly but clearly. Each one felt like a small victory, not because he was supposed to speak, but because now he chose to. At school, his new one, smaller and better prepared teachers listened when he wrote and didn't flinch when he didn't. Accommodations were made without complaint. Therapy sessions focused on rebuilding trust, not forcing normalcy. Caleb learned that what happened to him wasn't a personal failure. It was a system failure. Naming that truth took weight off his shoulders he didn't know he was carrying. The town felt different too, not cleaner, not forgiven, but aware. People looked at the school with new eyes. The parking lot where it happened no longer felt neutral. It carried memory now. Conversations changed tone. Parents paid closer attention. Kids whispered about what they had seen, about the day the bikers came and the lies stopped working. Some resented it, some denied it. But no one forgot it. As for the Hells Angels, they didn't linger. They never intended to. When the cases moved into courts and paperwork took over, they faded back into the edges of town life. One morning, just as quietly as they had arrived, the bikes rolled out in small groups, engines low, formation loose but intentional, no victory speeches. No raised fists. Just men who had done what their code demanded and moved on. Ronan stood with Stonewall at the edge of the lot, watching the last riders disappear down the road. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Kid's gonna be all right," Stonewall said finally, not as hope, but as assessment. Ronan nodded. "Yeah," he replied, "he is." Later, Ronan visited Caleb one last time before heading out on the road again. He didn't bring patches or promises. He brought coffee for the adults and a quiet nod for Caleb. Caleb looked up from the porch swing and met Ronan's eyes. He didn't reach for the notebook. He didn't look away. "I remember," Caleb said softly, the words steady. "You said you'd come back." Ronan smiled, just barely. "I don't say things I don't mean," he replied. As he walked away, Caleb watched him go without fear this time. The world still wasn't perfect. It never would be, but it was wider now. Safer. Honest in ways it hadn't been before. The town had been forced to see what it allowed, and a boy who once survived by being invisible had learned something better, that being seen, truly seen, could change everything. ChatGPT said, "The lesson carved into this story is not gentle, but it is true. Silence does not keep the peace. Silence protects bullies, systems, and anyone who benefits from looking the other way. For years, quiet hallways and polite paperwork allowed cruelty to grow roots. What saved Caleb was not authority, not policy, and not promises. It was brotherhood, the kind that shows up, stands still, and refuses to leave. Strength is often mistaken for volume, for shouting, for fists through walls and engines at full throttle. But real strength is presence. It is staying when it would be easier to walk away. It is listening when a wounded kid writes instead of speaks. It is choosing to be seen so someone else doesn't have to bleed alone. Honor runs through this story not as perfection, but as action. Redemption appears not in erasing the past, but in refusing to repeat it. Compassion is not soft, it is deliberate, disciplined, and sometimes uncomfortable. And family, the kind that matters most, is not defined by blood or paperwork. It is defined by who answers when the call comes. The most dangerous monsters do not always wear leather or ride loud machines. Sometimes they wear school colors, carry clipboards, and smile while damage is done. This story reminds us that courage often arrives in unexpected forms, and when it does, it has the power to change everything.